Thank you very much indeed, and perhaps my first word must be one of appreciation and thanks to those who behind the scenes make this lecture possible each year. I want to say how much I appreciate the faculty, the president, the faculty and the staff and others of this seminary. And it's always a privilege and a pleasure to be your guest on this occasion, yes, to feel a deep sense of gratitude for the honor that you accord me. And then I stay overnight, and I can then honor you as you graduate tomorrow. And we're excited by that as well. Perhaps the person I want to mention this evening, I want to be a little more personal, because I've discovered that in October this year, the dean of this seminary, Dr. Roanne Marie, will have served here for 10 years. And she was the very first staff person ever. Where is she? I saw her in the back. Maybe she's had to travel away. I'm not sure. Where is she? Is she there? Okay. But you will not, when you see these beautiful buildings and this amazing campus, you will not believe that we began in a few rooms in a block of flats down the road, and Roanne had to bring her own chair and her own table and her own laptop to begin working as the first staff person of Seth Mokitimi Methodist Seminary. And so I want to salute her tonight. Thank you. The second thing I would like to do is to salute our lecturer in absentia. I want to say thank you to Professor Malusi for a wonderful job. I mean, you first saw that text earlier this evening, it seems to me. And for you to be able to lead us through that lengthy and thick, in the sense of complicated, thoughtful, deep lecture, and to transmit Bishop Mpumlwana's thoughts to us was not easy, and I thank you for that very much indeed. And then to pay tribute to the bishop who wrote the lecture for this evening. We need to remember our heroes. We need to remember the saints of God, whose actions, if anybody's life incarnated his call to relate praxis with our theology, it was Bishop Mpumlwana when he was a younger man. It was he who, I remember at a funeral, one of those mass funerals which took place every weekend in the very bad days. The funeral was at King Williamstown. And it was at that funeral that some people saw a person who they identified. They said, it's an Mpimpi, we're going to kill him. And without any proof, without any evidence, the crowd began to get violent and emotional, and they began to prepare to kill this man in the middle of a funeral, because they believed he was, now everybody believed he was an Mpimpi. Whether he was or not, I do not know. But it didn't matter to Malusi Mpumlwana. What mattered was that people were about to commit a murder, and he went and put his body over that man and prevented them, and he called other clergy to come, including Bishop Desmond Tutu, until the clergy made a circle holding hands around that man who was already badly beaten, and saved his life. So here on the one hand is a follower of Jesus saving somebody who maybe was a bad guy. You don't know. Didn't matter to him. But the other side is another picture of Malusi Mpumlwana was to see him in the cells of the secret police being tortured, because he was tortured. And for him to say afterwards, the thing that saved me during my torture was to look at my torturer and to remind myself that he too was created by God, and that maybe I am here to help heal this man. So when he comes and tells us we should relate our prophecy to our praxis, he's talking from experience. He's not giving us a theoretical lecture. I think that we have heard some very, very important things tonight, and I would hope, first of all, I see that we have copies of this lecture, and that everybody present, I hope, and certainly all our seminarians, will receive that. And secondly, that maybe the bishop can be invited on another occasion, not too long in the future, to be present here after you've read his lecture and you have developed your own thinking about it and your own questions, and then you can have a conversation with him. I think that would be very, very helpful. So I'm not going to try and take his place, but I think he has raised some important questions for the church of now. And now is what matters. I think he's reminded us, as Walter Brueggemann reminds us, that in the Bible there are two narratives. There are two trajectories. There is the trajectory of religion being a support for the status quo. And then there is the other trajectory, which is the prophetic trajectory, which Biko would call the revolutionary one. And I think we need to face the fact. I hear a lot of talking about speaking truth to power. The church must speak truth. Of course it must. I think it's easier for the church to speak truth to power than for the church to speak truth to the church. And I do think we need to ask the question repeatedly. Every generation needs to ask the question. We heard a question, are Methodists different from other churches? I don't think that that's the question I would ask with respect. I would ask, are Methodists different from the status quo? And I would suggest that every church, Anglican, Methodist, Catholic, whoever, is tempted, always tempted, severely tempted, to worship itself, to become its own idol, so that ministry is seen as protecting, perpetuating, enlarging, empowering this thing called the church. We Methodists must become bigger and stronger and richer and more influential. Then we are doing the will of God. God doesn't even understand that kind of church. And the real question, it seems to me, that we have to ask the church, we have to speak truth to the church. And the question is the one that Biko asked. When will the church start following Jesus? It's as simple as that. When will the church stop worrying about itself and start following Jesus? And one of the reasons, when we designed this campus, we believe that spaces speak. They are not neutral. Spaces can speak to us. And that's why this chapel is so important. And that's why when you walk over that threshold, when you come into this chapel, you have to read those words again and again and again. I am among you as one who serves. And I think that being reminded of what Biko said to an Anglican bishop reminds me of what Nelson Mandela wrote to a Muslim leader. I have a letter written by Mandela to the head of the Muslim Judicial Council. He wrote that letter from prison, and he talked about his admiration for the Muslim faith and how it transformed people's behavior. And he said, I speak as somebody who has grown up as a Christian, and my background was in the church. But at the end of the day, the way I judge a religion, a faith, is how does its teaching and its action touch the poor and the marginalized? That is how I judge the validity, the authenticity, if you like, of a faith. And I am reminded of how we repeatedly try to spiritualize the message of Jesus. That instead of following him, we try to get religious about him. And not once did Jesus ask us to be religious. He just asked us to follow him, to do what he did. And if we become a little bit too boastful about Methodism being a form of Christianity which has had great social impact, and it has, let us remember that, like every other church or institution, we become fat and comfortable and rich. And when that happens, we lose our way. I don't know if you know this, but when Wesley set up the class meetings, where people had to gather in small groups every Sunday afternoon, and they had to examine one another. You remember the class system. Now we know the class system today is about collecting money. So don't get confused about that. John Wesley also collected money in the class system. Everybody had to bring a penny. But there were certain questions. And what was the question they had to ask each other? Can you tell me? I thought you would say that. How is it with your soul? That is not the first question that used to be on the list. That is not the first question. The first question was, in Wesley's time, what have you done in the past week to help the poor? That was the first question. And then 20, 30, 40 years later, when Methodists began to become respectable, and they began to wear suits like this, and they began to be, people around town, they didn't like that question anymore, and they dropped it. And they liked another question because it was so much easier to answer. How is it with your soul? And they could talk about their soul all afternoon in the class meeting. They could talk about heaven all afternoon. But Wesley's question was, what have you done for the poor in the last week? And so I think that Bishop Mpumlwana has really put some very important questions, and so has Steve Biko. For I want to tell you this. Never believe that God's prophets are only found in the church. They are not. I think some of God's best prophets are cartoonists. I think Zapiro will be right up there next to Elijah and Jeremiah and Isaiah, because Zapiro has been one of God's prophets in our country. He tells the truth. He pricks the proud. He pricks their bubble. And so let us read very carefully what God's prophets like Steve Biko have said. He grew up in the church, and he had the courage to speak truth to the church, not just to power. And we like it when he spoke to power, but we're not so happy when he spoke to the church. Now, why am I saying this? Because I cannot get out of my mind that I'm looking at people who are going to take the gospel to the people of this land. And I'm waiting for the first generation of graduates of Seth Mokitimi who, instead of falling in with the old habits of a church that wants to just protect itself, I'm waiting for the first generation who are going to give us an awful lot of trouble. Because then you will have decided to follow Jesus, the troublemaker. Thank you.